Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the 2017 Tax Debate Experience and Budget Reconciliation webinar. We're happy to have you here. A couple housekeeping as we get started. This will be recorded and sent out to all registrants. So please keep an eye on your inbox tomorrow for the recording. And you will also get any of the slides that the presenters are going to talk about today. So we'll keep those out and you're welcome to share those, and we'll also put this up on YouTube. But let's get into it. Thank you so much for joining us on this really important topic that things are going to get really busy going into 2025. Next slide. We like to start with our network. This is the National Council of Nonprofit Network. So you are not alone. You have colleagues across the country. If you are not a member of your state association, now is the time to join, because things are going to be fast and furious over the next couple months, and you want to get the information as quickly as possible, and you'll get it from your state associations. Next slide. But today we have a great lineup of experts from across the country on the things that happened in 2017 that you need to know about. We'll hear about reporters, the reporter perspective. We'll hear about specific issues, and then we're going to end with the budget reconciliation process. Next slide. But to start us off, I'm Tiffany Gourley Policy Counsel at the National Council of Nonprofits, and I want to do a quick recap of some of the provisions that we saw in 2017 that are expiring and will also be a big topic for what's going to happen in the debate coming up. Next slide. So first up, these are some of the provisions that passed, that some of them are expiring, some of them not. They tangentially affect nonprofits and how we are able to fundraise and do different operations, things like the standard deduction and SALT cap. Some of these we're going to go into and how they affect charitable giving specifically and how you're able to do your operations. Next slide. But it could have been much, much worse. And so these are some of the provisions that weren't included in the 2017 tax law that we were, as a network and as a coalition and as partners across the country, were able to keep out. Things like hurting and removing the nonprofit nonpartisanship provision, which Amanda Tyler is going to talk about. Things like restricting art hours, intermediate sanctions, and unrelated business income tax. This actually passed, but thanks to groups like Politico Pro, who actually launched this story, we found out how it affected nonprofits specifically, and we're able to work with news to be able to advocate to get it repealed, which we were successful in doing. So with that, I turn it over to Bernie Becker, who is the tax reporter at Politico Pro. He is a genius at taking complex tax issues and turning it into relatable, understandable issues. And so, Bernie, can you take us through what happened on the Hill, things that most people don't really see every day, and what we're expecting going forward?
Sure. First, thank you for that kind introduction. I'll try to meet up to the genius standard. I want to thank you all for having me. The National Council of Nonprofits has been sort of a wonderful resource to me over the years, so it's a great opportunity to speak to you all. If anybody out there has any questions while I'm speaking, please feel free to hit up the chat. I'm happy to answer them as I go. As Tiffany was saying, 2025 is going to be a huge year for tax policy. It's, for those of us who live and breathe tax policy, it's the year we've sort of had circled since 2017, which was when what's known as the Trump tax cuts were passed. Basically, what's going to happen at the end of this year is every sort of individual provision, the lower individual rates, the larger standard deduction that Tiffany was referring to, those all expire at the end of the year. I know some of those are very important to the nonprofit world. But before we get into the weeds like that, I want to take a step back and do a little big picture about what happened in 2017. So I think if there's anything people remember about the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which for the record is not its official name, though I'll let others tell you about that later. It's usually this. So, 2016, Donald Trump is elected. Republicans win full control of both houses of Congress. This is the first time they've had full control in 10 years. The first thing they really want to do is kill Obamacare. They spent months and months, more than half a year, trying to do this. But it's more than that, dude. There were starts and stops. There were almost successes. They passed it all through the House, then it gets stopped. And then there's John McCain's famous thumbs down. So it was a very bruising experience for Republicans. So when that happens, they reach the fall of 2017. It's near the end of Trump's first year in office. They have basically zero legislative achievements to point to. And so what do they do then? They pass the Trump tax cuts in basically a matter of weeks. We'll get more into how they did that in a second, but there's at least a couple reasons why they were able to do that so quickly. First off, and probably the biggest one, is Republicans really like to cut taxes. It's kind of what, it's kind of like second nature to them. There's actually a famous quote, which I'll read here. It's sort of, God put the Republican Party on earth to cut taxes. So when you take that, natural for them to sort of brush off what happened with healthcare, which is not as much an area where, God has spoken to them, they might say, and move on to taxes. But so even more than that, I think what you have to think about when we're looking at this, when you look at the 2017 process and moving forward, is that they ended up writing a 1,000-page plus bill in a couple months, maybe a little more, and the reason they were able to do that in a lot of ways was because they had been preparing for 6 years plus to write a tax bill whenever they got the chance, and when that chance presented itself, they were able to take it pretty quickly. So with that in mind, I want to dive in a little further on how they actually passed the 2017 tax law, how that might have affected you guys, what you might be able to learn from that, and maybe a bit about how things might be different or the same when a similar situation crops up this year. I will also apologize in advance because Congress is Congress is a topsy-turvy world a lot of times. Last month, if anybody's watching all the talk about funding, it's a ride. What I will say though is that the sausage making on the tax law in 2017 is not quite as exciting maybe as some of those other things. You didn't have a ton of near-death experiences or come to Jesus moments or these sort of cinematic behind closed door meetings where the Republicans said to themselves, "Oh, we'll just give ourselves one more chance," and then, against all odds, they were able to pass something. That's not really what happened here. You didn't even really get a lot of sort of like customary rank and file lawmakers saying, our leadership doesn't know what they're talking about. This is stupid. What are we doing? You really didn't have any of that. I think, partially that's, that's by comparison. I mean, we were still sort of adapting to like how different life in a Trump presidency is. It's sort of more chaotic by nature, so maybe things don't seem as chaotic in comparison. But I think the big reason is that Republicans knew they needed a victory. They were united, as I was saying, on taxes in ways they aren't on other issues. And so they were able to sort of, even the people you might have seen that like to stir the pot were not really pot stirrers at that moment. So I want you to keep that in mind as I lay things out and sort of talk about, more into how and why this happened. So I'm going to try to touch on sort of 2 or 3 areas where there were big moments and how that affected how the tax bill came off. And so I think the first one's not even really about taxes in a way. So what happened is in September 2017, there were 2 basically fairly anonymous Republican senators, at least to most of the country, and they made an agreement. And that's Bob Corker of Tennessee and Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania. What they agreed to was that there would be a tax bill, that if there was a tax bill, it could sort of cut taxes by $1.5 trillion over 10 years. And so I think it might be a slight exaggeration, but I think it's fair to say that sort of everything that happens after that flows from that decision. Essentially, if you give Republicans $1.5 trillion and say you can cut taxes with this, they will find a way to cut taxes by $1.5 trillion. And so that sets up everything that comes after it. That was not an agreement that was sort of broadly covered in the political press, in the congressional press. It was kind of under the radar, but it turned out to be, I think, one of the bigger deals of the entire debate. So why does that matter today? I think you're starting to hear more about this today. Republicans are going to need to do another number. They're going to have to find another number. It's not going to be $1.5 trillion. It's probably going to be a lot more than that. But once you have that number, how much Republicans are going to be able to spend, or how much they're going to be able to cut taxes, how much what they're going to be able to work with when it comes to doing some sort of big fiscal package that will involve taxes this year, probably will maybe involve the border, maybe involve energy. And for the nonprofit world, what that means is you kind of know what you're competing against. So once, in 2017, once they had this $1.5 trillion number, you could then say sort of, how can I get my priorities in there? What other things do I have to cut out, or what other things do I have to beat out to make sure we can make it in there? And so I think that when you look at 2025, that is sort of, how do I get a universal charitable write-off in there when we're also competing against, Trump wanting to exempt taxes on tips and that sort of thing. So those are things you want to, one of the lessons from 2017 is that once you have that number, you kind of know what you're fighting against. I think another big thing we learned from 2017 is, I think fewer members matter to the writing of a tax bill than you might think. So look at it this way, there's 535 members of Congress. This year, as in 2017, this is essentially going to be a Republican-only exercise. That means, 240 to 250 of the members of Congress are already somewhat unimportant from the start. I think the other sort of, deep, dark secret of Congress is that these guys aren't experts on everything. I mean, there are some tax experts in Congress, but far from everyone is. That's in part because some people choose to be experts in other things, or because they can't get on the right committees to become an expert or to show off their expertise. So when you look at it that way, essentially you're looking at, on the two relevant committees in Congress, you have maybe 15 Republicans in the Senate, 25 in the House, 40 in all. You've got leadership on both sides who's going to be there to sort of referee any disputes about whether this should be in there or whether it's out, or whether there's anger among the rank and file about how they're doing things. So you have them there. But I think when you're looking at 2017, I think that even overstates sort of how few people were involved in writing that bill. Sort of for weeks on end in 2017, tax reporters like me and others, we watched. There were four guys, men, all of them, who walked into a room on the Senate side in the Capitol and spent hours sort of, at the very least, doing semi-serious surgery on what became the tax bill. That was Tim Scott of South Carolina, Rob Portman of Ohio, Pat Toomey, as I mentioned earlier, Pennsylvania, and John Thune of South Dakota, who now, as it happens, is the Senate Majority Leader and will have a big role in whatever happens this year. So that's not to say that House Republicans were totally ignored, or that they had no influence over the bill at all, or that sort of thing. The SALT cap, which Tiffany mentioned earlier, that was made. I think that could have been worse, except for the fact that they realized they needed to sort of get votes in the House, so they sort of softened that a little bit. And that's I'm overstating things a bit. There were certain senators who were able to sort of be a fly in the ointment and get some changes made for them. That's kind of what senators do. They'll jump up and down, and sometimes they get what they want. But in the end, I think what you would say about the 2017 tax bill is that it's a Senate product. I think that happens a lot. I think the Senate sort of frequently big brothers the House, and this was one of those moments. They kind of said, you'll take what you get and you won't get upset, and they did. But I think that's also, if you look back at 2017, let's look at the majorities. The Senate majority was much narrower than the House's was. They actually lost a Republican senator during the actual tax debate, so they in Alabama, which made their majority even narrower. Whereas the House, by comparison, had a fairly comfortable majority. I think it was around 20 seats. So the Senate was basically able to say, this is what we can do. You have to take it or leave it, and the House took it. The difference now is that the House this year could have, at least for a while, as little as a one-House Republican majority. What that means is that basically any House member, and that's sort of the more topsy-turvy chamber. Any one of those guys or women can sort of make life difficult. And the Senate, meanwhile, has it's a 53-47 majority, which is, by Senate standards, somewhat comfortable. And so you're already seeing some of the Senate GOP leadership, I think, being more deferential now than they have in the past on these sorts of things, because of that knowledge that to get something through the House is going to be difficult. And so I'd say, and so the point of that is, the point of there being sort of a small universe of people who are going to actually make decisions on this is that that's something I think anybody who is trying to figure out how to influence a tax bill needs to know. You need to know who you have to influence, how, what's the best way to get to them, and that's a smaller number than you might think, and that's something to consider as we move forward. And I think, and the final point I'd like to make, just based on this, is sort of to always try and consider the broader context of why, Congress makes changes they do. When it comes to specifically what you guys are dealing with, I know for a fact that this group and lots of others were very upfront with Republicans in 2017 saying that if you raise the standard deduction by that much, if you lower the individual rates that much, that's gonna hurt us. Less people are gonna contribute if fewer people are itemizing their taxes. I think right now it's after TCJ, I think it's less than 1 in 10 people currently itemize. I think it was about a third back then. So that's a big pool of people who no longer who aren't itemizing, and that means that giving to charities may not be top of mind. And based on the numbers I've seen from this group and others, it seems like there is some stats that support that giving has fallen off since then. So we have to consider, why did Republicans make that decision? I'm not going to sit here and tell you that everything that members of Congress do is from some altruistic place, but in this particular context, I think one of the things that lawmakers and policymakers hear the most, people's biggest problem in the tax code, is that it's too complex. Americans, I think it's like billions and billions of hours Americans spend each year complying with the tax code, doing their taxes in January through April, that sort of thing. So one of the biggest tools Republicans had in 2017 to simplify taxes for at least a broad chunk of people is to raise that standard deduction that much. Again, like I said, it's about a quarter of the country now doesn't itemize. That's fewer hours on TurboTax, fewer hours, honestly, collecting receipts that they get at Goodwill or that sort of thing. And so that to Republicans is a real positive. I think they might say that they might sort of bemoan that the impact on charitable giving was, sort of an unfortunate collateral damage, but I don't think they see that as a mistake they made. I think they believe the standard deduction was, in a lot of ways, a positive choice that, gave time back to the regular American. And so I wouldn't expect them to reconsider that. And I think the point I'm making there, as we're trying to move forward, is that again, that the way to best try to make your point is to understand why it's being made. And I think for Republicans in 2017, that's why nonprofit giving was sort of became a loser, not because people don't like charities or people like giving, but because it lost out to what they thought was a greater good. So that's all.
Thanks, Bernie. That was really interesting and helpful. I think it's great context on kind of why they did what they did and how we got where we are now. A couple of questions. You mentioned 1.5 trillion was the number that they got in 2017. It just seems like, I don't know, fake money almost at that number, like that big of a number. And if you're saying a bigger number this year, how do they come up with like making up for that money? In this case, it looks like they're taking it out of charitable deduction. So
yeah, so I do think what happened is, so I think the thing, like the way 2017 is somewhat different is that, there were they did offset some of the amount of taxes that got cut was more than 1.5 trillion, and they sort of raised taxes elsewhere. So it was like a net tax cut of 1.5 trillion. What's gonna be different this year is that, a lot of the things they did, the reason things are expiring this year was to make that number look smaller. And so that means that if you want to extend a lot of the things they're talking about doing now, which are those lower rates, higher, all that stuff, that costs about $4 trillion on itself. And so if you're going to try to offset some of that, you're starting at a much bigger place. And so it's just going to keep ballooning too. It's sort of easy to talk about waste, fraud, and abuse in the government, but people like the government to do stuff. They like them to cut their taxes. They like them to do all sorts of things, and And so it's going to be hard for them to figure out how to keep these things and do so in a way that, may be fiscally responsible.
Well, thanks, Bernie. We're going to pause there. Stay on. We're going to do Q&A again at the end. But I do want to turn it over to kind of this section of expertise of issues that we saw in 2017. So with that, I turn it over to Amanda Tyler, Executive Director of BJC. She is one of the foremost experts on nonprofit nonpartisanship. We partnered with her in 2017 from the faith-based community. She has a new book out that includes about this nonprofit nonpartisanship issue called How to End Christian Nationalism. So you should check that out. But Amanda, thank you for being a leader on this, and we turn it over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Tiffany, for that introduction, and even more, thank you for the partnership that you and David have provided for, and the whole organization have provided with us and with the larger nonprofit sector in our collective efforts to protect and defend nonprofit nonpartisanship. It is incredibly important, and I'll just I know the people on this call know what we're talking about, but just to remind everyone that since 1954, one of the defining aspects of what it means to be a nonprofit organization, a charitable organization, is our agreement to be nonpartisan, not to be involved in campaigns for public office, either opposing or promoting or supporting political candidates. And that provision has been remarkably, for the most part, non-controversial and popular among the nonprofit community. And so it was something that kind of, in some ways, we know that this had been a pet political issue for a certain segment of people, but then, of course, candidate Donald J. Trump made this a campaign promise during his run for the presidency in 2016 that he would get rid of the Johnson Amendment. And so just a little bit about my personal involvement in this issue. I came to lead the organization that I still lead, Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, in January 2017. I came after spending 8 years working for a member of the House Ways and Means Committee, Representative Lloyd Doggett of Texas. When I left the Hill in December 2016, I really didn't think that I would be working much on tax issues when I went across the Hill to work for this nonprofit organization that works mostly on First Amendment and religious freedom issues. And yet there I was at the end of January presenting at a Hill briefing about the importance of nonprofit nonpartisanship and what that means to charitable religious nonprofits in particular, houses of worship, how that was something that most houses of worship wanted because it protects our independence from government. It respects the separation of church and state. It also preserves our prophetic witness, our ability to speak truth to power, and keeps political candidates and political parties from trying to control our religious missions. Many of the same reasons that the larger nonprofit sector also appreciates the provision of the tax code that protects nonprofit nonpartisanship. We know that in an increasingly polarized environment, that helps protect our integrity. It protects the goodwill and good standing that we hold in our communities. Sometimes our nonprofits and our houses of worship are some of the last places that we can be with people who vote differently than we do. And those are protections that we care about and that we want to keep. And so I think we were all we didn't quite have our feet under ourselves in the Trump administration in 2017. And on February 2nd, he made a speech when he vowed to totally destroy the Johnson Amendment. It was then that we started working very closely with National Council of Nonprofits, with other organizations like Americans United for the Separation of Church and State and Public Citizen, having just really important strategy conversations about how to bring as many voices from the nonprofit community together to express our strong support for existing law. At the time, I wrote a number of pieces pieces in op-eds and different publications. And I called it this provision seeking to amend the this nonprofit nonpartisanship piece of the tax law. I called it a problem in search of a problem, that there really was no problem that was being solved because the nonprofit community appreciated this protection, but it would create so many different problems. And so we created a number of different platforms at the time for nonprofit organizations to voice their support for current law. We had a standalone website called faithvoices.org, in which we allowed people of faith to sign on to an open letter to their to members of Congress to explain why, in the religious context, this was an important protection for them. And then, of course, there was also the website Give Voice that National Council of Nonprofits helped, that had thousands of nonprofit organizations voicing their support for the nonprofit nonpartisanship provision. We know that this kind of broad-based, diverse support from the nonprofit community was really meaningful to members of Congress, both to show that there was no need to change the law, but also to raise this as a controversial position, that this was not something that would be something that could just be slipped in at the end, because it was a controversial position that needed to have its own debate. In fact, the sponsors of the bill knew that if they brought this up for debate or for passage on a standalone bill, that it would fail. And so then we saw them take what was a standalone bill and try to fold it into the larger tax reform bill. And then while it was included in the House version of the bill, at the very last moment, the Senate parliamentarians struck it from the final version of the Senate bill, and we all celebrated that it was not included at the last minute in the 2017 bill. This was a real victory for the nonprofit community. As we were talking about the cost of the tax reform bill, I was reminded that something that really supported our efforts was that the Joint Committee on Taxation scored this particular provision that would have amended the law to allow for campaign support to flow through nonprofits. They scored it at, I believe it was just over $2 billion over 5 years in lost revenue to the US Treasury. That means that between $6 and $8 billion of additional contributions would flow through these nonprofits because they would be flowing to support candidates and political campaigns. This would fundamentally change not just the nonprofits that were being used basically as pass-through organizations for tax-free political contributions, but also would blow up with even more dark money, the cost of political campaigns and the partisanship. So I think this was another reason with these hard numbers that would show what the actual impact when it came to funding campaigns would be and how it would change the makeup of these nonprofits. That really was one of the deciding factors that kept this out of the bill at the last minute. I think another lesson learned from 2017 was there was this attempt in some ways to pit nonprofits against each other, which we really pushed back by joining forces. By having a strong response from the faith community, it helped answer these spurious claims that somehow nonprofit nonpartisanship was an infringement on religious freedom or on free speech. The religious community, a very diverse, broad, large religious nonprofit community, was able to speak from our different perspectives in one voice to explain why this kind of control by the government would actually be an infringement on our religious freedom. To say that pastors and imams and rabbis and other religious leaders are able to speak to the issues of the day without violating the tax law, and that they were not in support of this. So I appreciate the chance to reflect on what we all went through in 2017 and look forward to your questions and conversation about what that might mean for this next tax bill. Thank you all.
Thanks, Amanda. Yes, I was having flashbacks to the $2.1 billion number as well. And it's going to be, we'll see how this numbers change going forward, but stay on. We're also going to do some questions with you as well. So, but I do want to turn it over to Brian Flahaven to talk more numbers. So charitable giving, huge issue. We know that this is kind of where nonprofits all lie together, right? Is making sure that we're able to fund our missions and the work going towards our mission. Brian is the chair of the Charitable Giving Coalition and also vice president of Counsel of Advancement and Support of Education, also known as CASE. I don't know if I've ever said that full name out loud, but Brian, you led us on, making sure that nonprofits weren't forgiven and trying to include and expand charitable giving in the process of this. So tell us your battle stories as well.
Well, thank you, Tiffany, and also to all the folks at National Council of Nonprofits. Appreciate being here. It's also great to present along with Amanda, Bernie, and David as well. Bernie actually did a really good job of talking about the background leading up to tax reform. I'm going to just add a little bit of context to that around charitable giving and just a little bit more to the story. What I want to start with, though, is just giving you a little bit of a sense of the Charitable Giving Coalition for those of you who don't know. And I know many of you have signed on to our letters and have been a part of our efforts, but I have the privilege of serving as chair of the Charitable Giving Coalition, which is a coalition of charitable and faith-based organizations, as well as companies and individuals at both the national, state, and local level, all committed to preserving and expanding the charitable tax deduction, a deduction that's been around for over a century, and one that has encouraged Americans to give back to the charitable sector and to their communities. So it's a coalition of variety of organizations that have a variety of different interests in the nonprofit sector, a variety of charitable nonprofit organizations have different interests, but have all come together and are unified around preserving and expanding the charitable tax deduction. So if we go back to thinking about tax reform in 2017, there were a few things that we knew going into it. One, and Bernie talked a little bit about this, but one of those things was this was an all Republican game. So Democrats were not going to be a part of this because Republicans were going to use budget reconciliation to pass tax reform. So that was one really key point. The other piece that we knew going into it was that Republicans would be looking for revenue raisers. So as Bernie laid out, they needed to make sure that whatever they passed had a net cost of 1.5 trillion. That's what they agreed to. So they had to raise some revenue to get all the things that they wanted to get through. And so the revenue raises were going to be on the table. And one of the reasons the coalition actually formed back in 2009, the Charitable Giving Coalition, was because there was a proposal to directly limit the charitable deduction to 28% for high-income taxpayers. So it was a way to try to raise revenue off of itemized deductions, including the charitable deduction. So it wasn't just the charitable deduction, it was also charitable deduction, the mortgage interest deduction, and the state and local tax deduction. That was a proposal that was introduced by the Obama administration at the time. It gained some momentum, but our coalition, the Charitable Giving Coalition, and others had weighed in and said this was a bad idea. It would really discourage giving. It would hurt giving to charitable organizations. But that was still, and we were successful in pushing back against that proposal. It didn't make it into law, but there was still a lot of conversation around would limitations to itemized deductions be a part of the Republican tax bill in 2017, just because it raised a lot of revenue. So we were certainly watching that, any sort of effort to directly limit the charitable deduction. But while we were looking at that, we also knew, and Bernie talked about this as well, that Republicans were looking to simplify the tax code. So they were eager to do that. So the doubling of the standard deduction, while not directly impacting the charitable deduction directly, would have an unintended consequence because by doubling the standard deduction, fewer Americans would itemize their deductions, which means fewer Americans, because the only way you can benefit from the charitable deduction, the only way you can deduct your charitable giving is if you itemize. That would mean that fewer Americans would be able to deduct their charitable gifts, and that would have an impact on charitable giving overall. And I want to really reiterate the point that it's really important to remember the rationale for doubling the standard deduction was not to decrease charitable giving. There really was a rationale. The rationale Republicans were using was about simplifying the tax code. And in fact, there were a couple of provisions that were put in, or a couple other data points I think are important to think about as we think about that. Number one, as I said, they actually did end up limiting itemized deductions, but they didn't limit the charitable deduction. So there was a state and local tax deduction cap that many of you have heard of, I'm sure, and also a limitation on the mortgage interest deduction that was included as part of the tax reform bill. But they did not put a direct limitation on the charitable deduction. The other, I think, data point that's important is they also did increase the amount that individuals could give in cash to charitable organizations each year. Prior to the 2017 tax bill, you could give up to 50% of your adjusted gross income you could deduct each year. They increased that to 60%. Now, that didn't offset what happened with the doubling of the standard deduction and how that hurt giving, but it certainly was an effort to try to show that there was still that Republicans, in simplifying the tax code, were still trying to do some things to encourage charitable giving. Regardless of that, we really focused on the fact that we knew that the doubling of the standard deduction would have a more negative impact on charitable giving as well. And so we really worked to inform and talk with Republicans about the unintended consequence of what doubling the standard deduction would do to charitable giving, shared studies, did a lot of things to try to make the case to Republican lawmakers that they should include some sort of provision along with the doubling of the standard deduction that would make sure that all Americans would have the ability to deduct charitable gifts moving forward. So we were successful, as I said before, on not having a direct limitation on the charitable deduction, but unsuccessful in getting a provision in getting some sort of charitable deduction for non-itemizers into the final tax bill. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One was speed. This bill went very fast, and Bernie really laid out why it went fast, how it went so quickly. So we didn't have a lot of time to try to make the case. We had some champions that really did step up on the Republican side to help on the effort, but by the time we were able to get a foothold, the bill was moving so fast, and there was really an effort of, we got to get this win on the board in 2017 for Republicans. So that was certainly played a role in being unable to get this. The other was really, and it's really where the House Republicans on the Ways and Means Committee in particular had a very strong view that regardless of what was happening with the doubling of the standard deduction, all of the economic growth that would be generated by the tax cuts overall, by the bill overall, would more than offset any decline in charitable giving. That actually charitable giving would go up because of all of the other provisions in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Bill and the fact that the economy would grow. And that essentially economic growth would mean stronger and more robust charitable giving that would offset any decline that would happen because of the doubling of the standard deduction. So both of those reasons were why Republicans didn't include any sort of charitable deduction for non-itemizers, and really why we've been working since that time to work with Republicans and Democrats to build bipartisan support. So what were some of the lessons then from 2017? Well, one is we were unfortunately right about the impact of the doubling of the standard deduction, and there have been studies, including one that came out from Indiana University, University of Notre Dame, some researchers earlier, I should say mid last year, that show that there's been a $16 billion permanent decline in charitable giving from those who transition from being non-itemizer, I should say from itemizers to non-itemizers. So that certainly there's been an impact in terms of charitable giving. So we certainly have the evidence that there's an issue. And so we've been using and talking about that evidence as we've talked with lawmakers on both sides of the aisle these past 7 years as we prepared for 2025. I think it's important that we have bipartisan champions for this in both the Senate and the House. We had some great champions step up in 2017, including Senator James Lankford, who's a Republican from Oklahoma, who's continued to be a champion for this and is well positioned as a member of the Senate Finance Committee now to help lead this effort and champion this effort there. And we now have key champions up on both committees. So we have champions for charitable deduction for non-itemizers on the Senate Finance Committee and the House Ways and Means Committee. And those are the committees that are going to really drive a lot of the discussion around tax reform and the drafting of tax reform. The other thing that I think is really, really critical and important, and certainly the National Council of Nonprofits has played a huge role in this, is we actually have a unified sector around this singular proposal of a charitable deduction for non-itemizers. And in the last Congress, we introduced the Charitable Act was introduced on both the House and the Senate side. Bipartisan bill, Senator Lankford, Senator Coons leading the effort on the Senate side. On the House side, really Representative Blake Moore, Representatives Danny Davis, a Democrat from Illinois, Representative Blake Moore is a Republican from Utah, and also Representative Chris Pappas, a Democrat from New Hampshire, who are still in Congress. This Congress led that effort, introduced the bill. We had 64 bipartisan co-sponsors in the House. We had almost a quarter of the Senate, 24 senators equally divided between Republicans and Democrats supporting this in the Senate. So we've got a bill that and a proposal that will be reintroduced in the next couple of weeks that will help give us something that we can go up to the Hill, go into this tax reform debate on the front foot with our champions pushing this. And also critically for this political context, Republican champions pushing this on both the Senate and the House side. So that's a bit of more context about charitable giving and kind of what we've been working on at the Charitable Giving Coalition. And I'll stop there because I'm sure we'll have some questions at the end.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I'm glad you brought up the Charitable Act too, because I was going to ask you about that at the end, but you already talked about it. Because I think it's important to show that we're having this kind of two-prong attack on seeing what we can do with the 25 tax debate, seeing what happened, but also having a standalone bill that that gives us a chance as well. So thanks, Brian. Stay around. We're going to do questions, but I do want to turn it over to my dear colleague, David Thompson, who is going to talk about budget reconciliation. He's the Vice President of Public Policy here at the National Council of Nonprofits. We asked him to talk about this because he has the deep knowledge and battle scars and experience after being a longtime Hill staffer in the Senate. So, David, what do we need to know about this kind of arcane thing, and how does it affect nonprofits?
Thanks, Tiffany. Thank you, everybody else who's been speaking. This is quite exciting. You'd think tax stuff could be boring. It's not. I'll try to make budget reconciliation process not boring. My bottom line is this is to evade the filibuster, the process, and nothing we're saying is partisan. Each side of the, whenever the one party has a trifecta of House, Senate, and White House, they're going to go for budget reconciliation because it makes life easier for them. Let's go to the next slide. Typically, you're either for it or you're against it. If you're in the majority, you see it as the Emerald City at the end of the yellow brick road, and it's a wonderful, glorious thing. Or you see it as the Death Star because you're in the minority. It's not quite how we look at it. Instead, next slide, we see it as both part poli-sci, part history lesson, and a whole lot of fantasy. The 1.5 trillion was actually many trillions. Tax cuts are going to pay for themselves, things like that. So it's just leveling of expectations. A lot of things are said, but let's go to the next slide. We prefer to look at it not this way. I'm not going to drone on like Ben Stein and Ferris Bueller's Day Off and talk through the whole budget process of going from number 1 to 2A and so forth. Instead, next slide, we're going to try to do this as budget reconciliation bingo, because there are some funny phrases in there. There's some interesting details and so forth. So let's try it this way, see how this works. First off is next to the flag, you see the budget resolution. That's the normal way of the whole budget process proceeding. Nothing unusual yet. Normally, the House and the Senate budget chairs agree and ranking members agree on how much is going to get spent. They do a budget resolution that sets top line numbers. The 12 appropriations committees are bound by those numbers. And then the appropriations process goes forward, delayed, continuing resolutions, kerfuffles at the end of the year, and so forth. That's the normal. Because we have the trifecta, they get to do, next slide, a budget reconciliation bill. For the record, they could do 1, 2, or 3 reconciliation bills. The debate right now is whether they're going to do 1 or 2. House wants to do 1 where everything's clumped together. Senate wants to do 2. You can do a tax reconciliation bill that's just revenue adjustments. You can do a spending reconciliation bill that is just spending cuts or increases. Or you can do just a debt limit reconciliation. Actually, I'll put that last one aside. They're probably not going to do that. But question is whether they do one or the other. You can't do a combined bill and then later come back and do a tax bill. So there's some strict rules here. That is the whole point. The biggest point that I should have said from the beginning is that on this budget bingo, this reconciliation bingo, the middle thing is the most important part to keep in mind. all of these contortions and rigmarole and fantasies relate back to wanting to avoid the filibuster. So the majority party can do it with a majority vote, a majority plus one in their vote. Makes it easier to pass things that they couldn't get when there's split government. Next slide, please, is the next one, is an important one. Bernie referenced this. In 2017, two senators agreed to net spending of 1.5 trillion, net loss of 1.5 trillion in revenue. As Bernie said, they probably had tax changes of 2.2, I think, trillion in revenue, but they made up some of that other number. In the process, the budget resolution has budgetary goals. They set a number, they set a target, and then they have to meet them. Next slide is some things that Bernie and others have talked about that I just wanted to mention here before I get into the really interesting stuff coming up, which is they can do it by permanent law. A slide that Tiffany had earlier said that they've created a new tax on higher education, some higher education endowments. They made that one permanent. They can make things permanent, tax increases often. Or they can do a budget window, within 10 years, you can only spend X amount within a 10-year period. So they limit it that way. Or they can sunset early, as Bernie said. The issues that are coming up for 2025, at the end of this year, the individual tax breaks, like doubling the standard deduction, like increasing how much you can donate, adjusted gross income, are all things that are sunset after 8 years instead of 10 in order to shrink that number. To shrink to 1.5 trillion seems oxymoronic, but that's why those numbers are there, to fit within the budgetary goals. Next slide. I want to focus on the reconciliation directives. These are sometimes called reconciliation instructions or committee instructions. This is kind of the main event in terms of who does what. In the past years, the budget resolution will instruct 17 different committees to come back with, will give them instructions to come back with spending cuts or tax changes. And not all of the 17 committees have stuff in the ultimate reconciliation bill. So I mentioned that even if the budget resolution names 17 committees to do stuff, not necessarily all of them are going to do it. So I'm trying to build some hope here. The requirement is that the budget directive it's needed to trigger budget reconciliation, but they instruct committees to change existing law so revenues, spending, and debt limits align with the budgetary goals in the budget resolution. So that's, again, focused on fiscal impact, which is the next point. Next slide, please. All of these are related, so I've clumped them all together. Revenue effect. Anything in the budget resolution bill, whether it's a tax provision or a commerce committee or border security, has to have a revenue effect. The Byrd rule was created because the budget resolution process avoids the filibuster. Well, there have to be guardrails in order to protect the integrity of the Senate process because they're doing away with the filibuster. So the Byrd rule says any of the provisions in the bill, in the budget reconciliation bill, must have revenue effects. And anything that doesn't, anything that's an extraneous matter, is dead to the bill. It must be stripped out. There's 6 definitions of what could be considered an extraneous matter. I didn't list them because most of them don't matter. Most of them are purely procedural and detailed and in the weeds. Only one of them really matters. But let me list the 6 just so you know. If a provision fails to meet the budgetary goals, you see that box up there, not in compliance with the reconciliation directives, one committee's stealing somebody else's jurisdiction, you can't do that. Changes are included in there that are merely incidental to revenue effect. I'll come back to that one. Changes are beyond the budget window. Budget window is usually 10 years. If the changes have an effect beyond 10 years, it'll get kicked out. or if it changes Social Security. Thou shalt not change Social Security through budget resolution. So of those 6, the most important is merely incidental. And a couple of examples that we've talked about so far, Bernie suggested, predicted that I would say this, and he's correct. The Senate parliamentarian has the job of doing a bird bath, cute name, doing a bird bath to determine what is extraneous, what is merely incidental. The current parliamentarian is Elizabeth McDonough. She can be considered either Glinda the Good Witch or the Wicked Witch of the West. No, wait a minute. That's being rebranded now. So the Wicked Witch of the North, depending on your perspective. It's her job to rule on whether something is extraneous, whether it's merely incidental. And I defy anyone to accuse any of our parliamentarians of ever being partisan. They are the most scrupulous referees I've ever encountered. It's her job to determine what is and what is not. In terms of merely incidental in the 2017 tax, subsequently, Democrats wanted to raise the minimum wage in a budget reconciliation bill, and it would have adjusted tax revenues in some way, but it was a policy issue in reality. And she struck it, well, the parliamentarian said, no, you can't do that because any money impact is merely incidental. Bernie suggested the name of the law, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Senate parliamentarians scratched that because there was no revenue effect. She also took out, as Amanda described, and it was a little more dramatic than Amanda described. You've heard of things happening at the 11th hour. This happened at the 11th hour and 59th minute in terms of taking out the language that dealt with nonprofit nonpartisanship, the so-called Johnson Amendment. And she stripped that out because even though there was a cost of costing the Treasury of $2.1 billion over 10 years, that dollar figure was merely incidental to the fact that this was a policy question of allowing or not allowing preachers to endorse candidates from the pulpit and things like that. So very scrupulous. You can't do everything in the tax law or through budget reconciliation. And that's an important safeguard that all of us need to hang our hats on. Let's go to the next slide. This is my final one. Bird droppings, the things that the parliamentarian rules don't apply or dropped out of the bill. If they're still kept in the legislation when it comes to the Senate floor, any senator can raise a point of order saying this is an extraneous matter that must be stricken, and it takes a vote of 60 to change that or to overrule the ruling. It can also be done as a motion to commit. That's not that big a deal. And the only reason I put vote-a-rama here is it's a cute term. At the end of the budget resolution vote and at the end of the budget reconciliation bill vote, they run out of time. There's time limits. They run out of time. And you'll see senators voting on 50 different amendments. 2 minutes of debate, a vote. 2 minutes of debate, a vote. It can take hours. You'll see senators walk out of the process a little dazed and confused. May have walked in that way because it's a very painful, tortured process. They throw out, frequently senators will include amendments that are purely partisan or trying to put the other side on record, embarrassing and so forth. But it's a torturous process that can work to nonprofits' advantage if you get an amendment in there to make a point. That's it. I'll now turn it back to Tiffany and hope everybody else will come on screen for questions and answers.
Thank you. Yes, please come on back on screen, speakers, if you're able to. Thanks for going through all of that. That was I think, deep dive into what happened in 2017. I got called an old timer recently because I was here in 2017, and I took that as a badge of honor, to be honest. So it was a pleasure to be here with all of you as old timers as well. So a couple questions that we have, and feel free to ask questions of each other too. We have about 6 minutes. So Amanda, first question for you. We hear a lot that the nonprofit nonpartisanship, whenever specifically going towards the Johnson Amendment, it's just preachers preaching from the pulpit. It's a First Amendment thing. Why does this have anything to do with money or taxes or anything outside of that? Like, can you respond to that from a faith-based perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think, when we actually talk to preachers and ask them, do you feel limited at all by this provision? Do you feel like it does limit what you can preach on? The answer is a resounding no. I think that there are other reasons that pastors or other religious leaders might shy away from talking about issues, but it's not the tax law that's holding them back. And in fact, I often hear from religious leaders that they are grateful to have a legal reason to explain to their congregants why they won't endorse a particular candidate or not. But I think what we saw from that score that this received is that this really isn't about a Sunday morning sermon. This is about an ability to really divert all of this political spending through the coffers of houses of worship, and of course other nonprofits as well. But it often starts out as really being focused on religious nonprofits, in order to, one, of course, get the tax deduction and have that most favorable tax treatment, but two, to keep their donations secret. Because as it should be the case, religious organizations are given quite a hands-off approach from the government. I think that's one of the benefits that's given to religious nonprofits, benefits that my organization defends, because that's an importance of separation of church and state, and that the government not have control over religious affairs. But what comes with that, if you mix that with the giving of political contributions, then we're going to have a situation where we don't have the kind of accountability that we need for political contributions in a system, that's kind of beyond the scope of this call, but in a system that already has a lot of loopholes and a lot of dark money. So I think that those arguments are really red herrings, and they're not reflected of the concerns of the religious sector.
Brian, I have two questions in the chat for you. So overall, has charitable giving gone up since this passed? What about inflation? And then the second question is, in meetings, we keep getting told that the Charitable Act doesn't pass because it costs tens of billions of dollars a year. So, would a revenue neutral approach be more likely to gain traction? Is there another way to approach this that we should consider?
No, two good questions. So has giving gone up? If you look at overall aggregate total giving has gone up. But the question is, how far should it have gone up? And it's also important to think, and I think there was even a follow-on to that around inflation. So if you look at Giving USA from the past year, for example, Giving USA found that giving was up in 2023. That's the most recent data that we have. But if you adjust for inflation, was actually down by about 2%. And if you think about that, we had a really strong economic year in 2023. So if you remember the rationale behind some of the rhetoric around charitable giving back in 2017, the rationale was, well, economic growth will raise all boats and raise charitable giving. What we've started to see, unfortunately, is a disconnect between that. So charitable giving hasn't kept up in pace with economic growth. And we've started to see that disconnect happening. And actually in 2022 was even a more stark disconnect between what was happening in the economy and charitable giving, as giving was down pretty significantly adjusted for inflation, almost 10%. So charitable, it's definitely a mixed picture. I think it's also important to remember that beyond aggregate total charitable giving, and the fact that giving is down from that perspective, it's also important to remember the number of donors. The number of donors was on the decline before the tax law, and has just continued to accelerate. So we are under 50% of Americans who give to charities each year, and that number continues to decline each year. So one of the things that we hope a charitable deduction for non-itemizers can do by offering and expanding the charitable deduction, making it available to all Americans, we can actually expand the deduction, expand the number of donors, and start to reverse that trend of declining donors and bring that giving back to our organizations, which obviously we all know is needed more than ever. In terms of cost, it's a very interesting question. And one of the things I did talk about the Charitable Act, but I didn't talk about its specifics. And one of the things in the Charitable Act is it would essentially allow individuals who are non-itemizers to get up to roughly $5,000 a year, deduct up to $5,000 a year, and it's about $10,000 for joint filers. Now, if you think about the itemized charitable deduction, there is no limit besides the limit, adjusted gross income limitation on giving. So why is there a cap for this non-itemizer deduction? Part of that is a reference to the fact that there is a cost significance, that it is a costly provision by having that. So having some sort of cap on there helps bring the cost of the provision down. The other thing that's important is if you're giving above $5,000, or if you're a joint filer giving, or a couple giving above $10,000, you're most likely itemizers already. So we're mostly capturing most of the non-itemized giving, even with the cap. So I think there is a recognition that we have to manage costs. Certainly our champions are supporters are, we're pushing for the most generous charitable deduction for non-itemizers we can get this year, but it certainly is going to be that big number that Bernie was talking about is going to be very important in terms of how generous a charitable deduction for non-itemizers is if we're able to get it in the bill.
I just add, we're running out of time. Not to be flippant, but a $4 trillion bill, a 10 or 20 or $30 billion cost of the non-itemizer bill that reverses the challenge, that reverses all the negative trends and encourages people to give to smaller nonprofits that have been left out is well worth the investment.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, I think that takes us to the top of the hour. Thank you all for joining. Thank you all for joining us, listening in, and thanks for our great speakers. We are having a follow-up webinar on this next week, same time, same place. So 4 o'clock Eastern. We're going to go forward into what we expect now in the 2025 tax debate. So the recording and the slides will be provided to everyone who registered. And thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day.